History is often the story of what could have been, and there are very few anime that can embody this notion so completely and as well as Orguss. Back in the mid-80s, Harmony Gold was about set to change the anime game forever here in America with their bold idea, Robotech, which we'll get to someday, comb your tits. Led by good old Uncle Carl Masek, Harmony Gold, along with Tatsunoko Productions, spearheaded the Robotech project, an amalgamation of 3 separate anime series: Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross, and Super Dimension Sentry Orguss. However, due to rights issues with Big West Frontier, the producer of all 3 shows, Harmony Gold wound up choosing Genesis Climber Mospeada to round out the triumvirate. All 3 shows, despite sharing similar names, were never set in the same universe, so Harmony Gold replacing one means little in the grand scheme of things. But just like that, Orguss missed an opportunity to be a part of the history of anime in America. Eventually, the series did wind up getting released here in the early 90s, but only half of the 35 episodes were ever dubbed due to poor sales, and it was completely out of print until Discotek Media purchased the license a few years ago. There are a lot of what-ifs you can ask surrounding this story, but the most pertinent, at least for today's episode's purposes, is would Orguss' sequel exist if it were a part of Robotech? In between Orguss bouncing around different states of quasi-existence, a sequel OVA series was produced and it too was released here in the States, thankfully dubbed in its entirety. And I say thankfully in the most backhanded way possible. Now, while I called Orguss 2 a sequel, it's practically by name only. Since it's set hundreds of years in the future, the fact that it has any kind of narrative connection to the original Orguss TV show is rendered down to a formality more than anything else. Hence why I'm not sweating over the fact that I haven't talked about Orguss yet. But to the point at hand, Orguss 2 might be the most difficult and most confounding anime to critique I've had to do in quite some time. Why? Well, it's because it's hard to come down on either side for it. We'll get into the blood and guts of what I mean, and trust me, it's going to get quite messy, but suffice it all to say, Orguss 2 is an anime that makes it frustrating to call it either bad or good. Perhaps by the end of the review I'll be able to crystallize my feelings on it a bit better for all of you, but for now, all I'll call it is... First, it has to be said that the opening credits are startlingly good. Not only does it feature some fantastic visuals and design, reminiscent of more than a few Bond films, but the music feels ripped straight from a David Bowie album. Okay, so the album in question is Black Tie White Noise, but it's still strangely catchy. We soon learn that this is a sort of post-apocalyptic future where the weapons of man's past has caused untold ruination. The world is now governed by 2 kingdoms that constantly do battle with each other using giant mecha excavated from the seafloor called decimators.
We weren't aware you'd be arriving, but we're trying to find appropriate accommodations for you.
Good. My subordinate will require accommodations as well.
There you go.
It's a seeker.
Easy there. Here's your cane.
One of the very first things that jump out at you about Orguss 2 is the fact that it's strangely quiet. Dovetailing what I said about visual storytelling in my Lilycat review, Orguss 2 also spends a good chunk of time without much being said, but the way these scenes are played out, they don't need to. For instance, it's established that the military uses what are called Seekers, and it doesn't take long before the anime shows what Seekers are for, all without telling the audience explicitly what they do. I always love it when anime can take full advantage of being a visual medium and tell its story without having to say much of anything. And while I'm on the subject of scripting and storytelling, I also have to say that this might be the tightest screenplay I've ever seen in an anime. And what I mean by that is that every scene, every line of dialogue, everything a character does has a set meaning and importance behind it. There is hardly an ounce of fat anywhere to cut in this anime. Even when the scene in question is just the characters milling around and talking about the lousy food, it's there for the audience to gain a foothold into the lives and everyday minutiae of the characters.
All it's fit for is bird food.
Goes down like cement, doesn't it? But in another week, we won't have to worry about that.
That's true enough. When we get back to Garam, I'll ask Syl and Toria to cook up the greatest dinner you've ever had in your life.
Great. Sounds good.
Sure, the dialogue itself is pretty bland and at points downright terrible, but considering these characters are supposed to be blue-collar longshoremen, it's more appropriate that they talk like this instead of sounding like they were scripted by Aaron Sorkin. Besides, the point of the scene wasn't to be invested in their conversation, but for you to get the notion of the kind of working relationship these two characters have, and how the younger one here, despite suffering from a bad case of greenhorn, does have a sharp mind between his wet ears when he correctly guessed an oncoming plane being an Allied vessel just by hearing its engine. Lastly, the plot keeps moving forward, only stopping for the necessities along the way. It's not relentless or lightning quick or anything like that, it just keeps chugging along at a great clip. The anime itself is 3 hours long, but I swear watching it, it only feels an hour and a half. And right on cue, just as the arriving Lieutenant Manning inspects the newly found decimator, our Rook puts two and two together.
I can go back with you? Right now?
Correct.
Hey, that's great, right?
Are you in a big rush, sir?
You sure can bet your allowance on that, kid. We need operable decimators.
To defend the capital? Is there a war coming?
You're sharp, aren't you, kid?
You see what I mean about how the anime lets moments go by without any of the characters saying anything? That little pause Manning had spoke way more about both him and the Rook than anything he could have said. And right on the money, the Kingdom of Zaffron attacks, taking out the pilots and leaving only the Rook to helm the newly found decimator. But it seems he's no new type.
Okay, don't let yourself tighten up, kid. You want to stay loose as a goose.
Has he got a prayer? Tell me.
Not if we keep him in the air, he doesn't.
What?
Oh, and the people of Zaffron also speak their own made-up fakey language, just in case we didn't have enough connections between Orguss and Macross. Hearing his orders, the Rook manages to grapple with the Zaffron soldier and get him on the ground, where he torches the son of a bitch with his rocket boosters. Oh, snap! But trouble doesn't stay too far away behind, as the mustachioed mechanic is sniped when he inadvertently gives their position away.
Leave, be careful! We're in a zone! Armed decies everywhere! They've tracked our craft and are approaching. Get over here, but be careful!
They'll both be slaughtered!
Leave. No, go back.
Oh no! Boss, you've been hurt!
And how the hell did I know that? Yeah, the cracks in the foundation start appearing when the cast has to act. The lead is especially cringy in how he portrays Lean here. Yeah, his name is Lean, like he actually was a goddamn new type. If it's all the same to you guys, I'm just gonna keep calling him Rook. But getting back on topic, the dub is surprisingly bad, considering the wealth of talent it had at its disposal in Steve Bloom, Wendy Lee, longtime and much-missed director Kevin Seymour, and allegedly Bryan Cranston. The problem is that these talents are mainly in the background, with our leads being played by one-and-doners, for lack of a good term, which is unusual for the studio behind it, Animes, which was responsible for some of the greatest dubs of all time. I can't pretend to know why the dubs sound so stilted and wonky half the time, but sadly, that is not the last of the anime's problems.
You guys save the melodrama for another time. Get your ass over here. I'm only 32 years old. I'm too young to die. And when I do go, I don't want it to be like this.
Right.
I don't care if I'm burying the lead with this, I have to come out and say it right now. Lieutenant Manning is one of my favorite characters I've ever had the pleasure of covering on this show. He's a conniving, opportunistic, slick-witted asshole, and I can't help but love him to bits. He's the perfect jaded foil to the Rook's dopey-eyed innocence, and when the mechanic dies from his wounds, despite the Rook's best efforts to rescue him, Manning basically dupes him into joining the army and become his gopher to alleviate the mechanic's family's debts.
You need money, am I right? There's a war coming, Sonny. A big one. Want to get rich? 'Cause being a soldier is gonna be very lucrative. There's money in war, boy. Join up and you'll be rolling in wealth.
Of course, such an impressionable and naive mind can and will be led astray, and it's not long after that the Rook finally sees Lieutenant Manning for who he is.
Damn it! I can't find your position and I'm being pursued! Saving you is impossible! This is my last transmission. Listen very carefully.
Yes?
Good luck, kid.
Did you say good luck?
Men have died for less treacherous acts, but when the Rook manages to defy the odds and escapes and confronts Manning about it, he's got a plan for that too.
You're not a ghost after all. Don't get me wrong, Lean. I'm not crying because I'm so overjoyed that you're still alive. I just didn't want to pay for your funeral.
Oh my god, this guy is the perfect shitheel scoundrel. How can you not gravitate towards such an unabashed asshole? Now, I can hear all the people who have already seen Orguss 2 typing in the comments right now about a certain scene later in the anime, but cool your jets. We'll talk about it soon enough. In the meantime, Zap Brannigan Manning here ain't whistling Dixie as both kingdoms are itching for war, and this is where the plot really comes into its own. From the outset, we're expecting a story that is equal parts Macross and the Big O, but now we get a healthy dose of Game of Thrones. Because the setting is a hodgepodge of futurism and historical fantasy, we're treated to the royal politics that are guiding the kingdoms toward inevitable war. Both families know not the forces they trifle with and only care that the enemy is at the gates. And if that weren't enough, we even get our own version of King Joffrey. Also, I know this isn't apropos of nothing, but I'd be neglectful if I didn't mention the Queen's massive knockers! No wonder she's got half the kingdom wrapped around her finger. They're all too busy trying to escape the gravitational pull of her planets. Woof! But how does this all relate to our main character, the Rook? Directly? Not much. But like all stories of war, there are many narrative paths. While the castle itself is embroiled in a cunning and cutthroat game of intrigue, the Kingdom of Zaffron has excavated a monstrous decimator, and only by the guile of Rook and Manning does their country even know about this walking death machine. Not only that, but it seems that Zaffron is also pursuing this mysterious woman for reasons unknown. And when Rook and Manning become separated, it's a race to stop Zaffron from annihilating everything in its path and unlock the mysteries surrounding this seemingly out-of-place woman. By now, you can probably tell that I've been jumping around the story for this review, and that's because, despite my mixed feelings on it, I do want you all to go out and see it if you haven't. But I can't in good faith tell you that without also talking about the bad of Orguss 2, which is going to be difficult. I already mentioned that the acting is uneven, to put it mildly, but it's not helped at all by the dialogue. At best, it's wooden and completely utilitarian, and at worst, well... Alright, this is going to require some lead-in, so bear with me here. If anyone knows Orguss 2, they know it for a single infamous line. In fact, this line is so infamous that it's listed as 2 different videos on YouTube, one called Worst Line in an Anime Ever, and the other called The Greatest Line in Anime History. And I'm gonna halt this hype train before it even leaves the station. It's neither. I mean, come on, this is Anime Abandon. We've encountered mindfuck lines seemingly on a daily basis.
But if this is justice, then I'm a banana.
She'll thaw out if you stick your finger up her ass.
What?
Bo has a laser cannon!
But it is still terrible. Lieutenant Manning leads the mechanic's daughter and would-be sweetheart of the Rook out of the castle dungeon, and this prickles at him doing something selfless. Now, we've seen this before. It's basically the scene where a kid throws rocks at a dog to get it to run away and save itself, even though it kills the kid to do it. But I swear you haven't seen it like this. And I'm also going to warn you, it can be quite upsetting. So if you want out, skip to this part of the video.
There are 2 tickets for belts inside of there. I want you to take your mother with you and leave right now.
You're just gonna leave me?
Are you deaf? Train leaves at 7. Now get going.
But why are you being so kind?
Go before I throw you down on the ground and rape you.
Bless you. Thanks.
Okay. Let's start with the obvious. Manning, I know you were just trying to get her to take the tickets and leave while she can, but considering you've demonstrated just how fast you can think on your feet, couldn't you have thought of a more eloquent thing to say to encourage her to not lollygag around and risk capture than to threaten to rape her? Also, I never thought I would see the day that I would have to tell anyone this, but as I live and breathe, lady, your response to a rape threat should not be blessing them. And since I'm already breaching the subject, I might as well talk about the other elephant in the room when it comes to this script. If you care about spoilers, then you can skip to this part of the video. And wouldn't you know it, it also involves Manning as he follows the new king as he explains why he had to act a fool up until he poisoned his own half-brother. Hey, twinsies!
In order to prevent that bitch from assassinating me, I've pretended to be mentally retarded for 7 years. There was nowhere that was safe. Only on this little island could I be myself and have sanctuary. The little flower garden here became my own kingdom.
Question. How? Like, shouldn't people around you know that you are of sound mind? I mean, by your own admission, you spent 7 years playing possum, but you're obviously older than 7, so what? Did you pay some guy to pretend to bonk you on the head and that's how you pulled a Stiller?
You went full retard, man. Never go full retard.
So the dub and dialogue share a symbiotic relationship where they both feed into each other to create a perfect mess. But these are both problems that are boiled down to the localization. A redub and translation could do wonders in fixing this. However, the ending, not so much. Since I already put up a spoiler warning, I don't have much reticence to say that the ending just plain sucks. You've been invested in this wild story of robots and kings and scoundrels, but then it up and decides that it suddenly wants to be an Orguss sequel and drags this robot into the fray. Who also just so happens to sound like the cybernetic ghost of Christmas Past from the future.
The space-time oscillation bomb was designed to transport its target into a different dimension. However, it turned out to be an imperfect weapon, as it not only affected the enemy, but also surrounding space. Inadvertently, it created a variety of different dimensions, a mosaic of worlds. As a result, beings from different dimensions ended up living in an entirely new place.
The war of man against machine raged on through the early 70s.
Yup, if you remember the original Orguss, you know all about the space-time oscillation bomb, and thanks to the cybernetic ghost of Christmas Past from the future, we're all conveniently on the same page. The last 2 episodes is basically the anime throwing away all the goodwill it managed to build up by having this robot come in and dump all this exposition on all of us, which is baffling to me because the anime didn't do crap like this, at least until now. Because of this hard left turn, the plot is left absolutely derailed with the king taking over his own massive decimator and then being driven mad by it, and then he destroys Zaffron like it was nothing. Well, there goes all that tension you've been so careful to build, and the Rook and Manning just wind up shooting the king. Whoop-de-doo, the entire anime basically amounts to this.
Don't someone mess with time! No, with time, mother...
I know that Orguss 2 is far from the only anime that suffers from a terrible third act, but for some reason or another, this hurts worse than the others I've experienced. I'm looking at you, Desert Punk. And I think it all comes down to the fact that for the first 4 episodes, I found myself shucking and jiving with the anime. I loved how every single little thing was building up to something, and I loved how it forced the viewer to pay attention to what was going on with stretches of visual storytelling. Plot-wise, the first 4 episodes are flawless. And then the last 2 episodes happen, and I feel like I've been kicked in the gut. But after having the time to think about it and talk about it, I realized that the reason why Orguss 2 hurts so much was because I didn't expect it to hurt. If I had gone into Orguss 2 having known that the ending shits the bed, I would have been disappointed, sure, but I wouldn't have felt it as strongly. Yet, I also believe that everything, not just anime or movies, but every form of entertainment should have the right to surprise you, both by how good it is and how bad it is. So, at the end of the day, I have to come to terms with the fact that, despite everything, I do like Orguss 2. I mean, looking at it purely mathematically, the fact that I liked 4 out of the 6 episodes means at least 2/3 of it is good, but that's hardly a glowing recommendation. But if you are the kind of person who can appreciate the whole despite the many broken parts, then I do think you can find a lot to like in Orguss too. Sometimes life makes it pretty difficult to like something, but that doesn't mean you can't like it. And then there are times in life where it's pretty clear-cut whether you like something or you hate something. Till next time.